The world remembers kings, conquerors, and empires, but heaven remembers men and women who walked by faith. After the apostles of the Lamb, God never stopped raising witnesses. They preached when it was illegal. They believed when it was dangerous. They endured when it cost them everything. This is Heroes of Faith, the true stories of believers whose lives proved that God is real. His power is timeless, and faith still changes the world. Kindly like, share, and subscribe, and let their faith strengthen you.
She was standing alone in a dark hallway, in the dead of night, her hand wrapped around a cold doorknob, the door to a bathroom where a bottle of poison waited on the shelf. She was 20 years old. She had been betrayed by the man she loved. She had lost her faith in God. She could not sleep. She could not eat. And somewhere in the deep, broken silence of that night, a voice whispered that there was no point in going on. And she almost listened. What happened next, not just in that hallway, but in the decades that followed, became one of the most extraordinary stories of faith, sacrifice, and supernatural courage in the history of modern missions. A woman who started her life as an agnostic. A woman who was once told she was too proud and too rebellious to serve God. A woman who would eventually trek over 12,000-foot mountain passes in the wildest jungles of southwest China, deliver babies by candlelight, survive dysentery, war, Japanese bombs, communist armies, and the death of nearly everyone she loved, and do it all, not for fame, not for comfort, but for a hidden tribal people called the Lisu, whom most of the world had never heard of. This is the story of Isobel Kuhn, also known as Belle, born in 1901, a daughter of Canada, a servant of God, and a hero of faith whose legacy still echoes through the mountains of China and Burma to this very day. To understand who Isobel Kuhn was, you have to first understand who she was not. She was not a saint from birth. She was not a quiet, obedient church-going girl who had her whole life figured out. She was sharp, brilliant, fiercely independent, and for a time, completely convinced that God, if he existed at all, had nothing to do with her life. She was born Isobel Miller in 1901 in Toronto, Canada, and grew up on the west coast of British Columbia, the daughter of Samuel and Alice Miller. Her father was a lay preacher, her mother the president of the Women's Missionary Society of the Presbyterian Church. Her grandfather had been a Presbyterian minister in England. Missionaries regularly passed through the Miller home, coming from and going to places like China. As a young girl, Belle had once found their stories exciting. But by the time she was 14 years old, standing on a Vancouver dock watching yet another missionary ship pull out to sea, she felt nothing but irritation. It was 1915. The world was at war. Her brother Murray was preparing to ship off to France to fight in the trenches of the Great War. And as Belle stood on that dock, a well-meaning missionary named Dr. Isaac Page placed his hand on her shoulder and said, with all the warmth in the world, "Isobel, I am going to pray that God will send you to China as a missionary." Belle's internal response was swift and unambiguous. "You mean thing." She had no intention of becoming a missionary. She had plans. Big, ambitious, self-determined plans. She would attend the University of British Columbia. She would study English literature. She would become a university professor. She would live a blazing, glorious life, not, as her grandmother had written in her autograph book, an adding up of days in which good work is done. When Belle read those words, she shrugged. How dull. How utterly, completely dull. But God, as he so often does, had other plans. In the fall of 1918, 17-year-old Belle walked through the doors of the University of British Columbia, head held high, determined to squeeze every ounce of joy out of campus life. She was extraordinary by any measure. She played piano and guitar, sewed her own dresses, won the provincial speech prize, took first place in academic achievement in the entire province of British Columbia, earning a special medal from the Governor-General of Canada himself. She was radiant, popular, elected secretary of the Student Council in her sophomore year, and by her second year, she had fallen completely in love. His name was Ben. He was tall, athletic, charming, a returned soldier from the Great War. They became unofficially engaged. Belle's whole future seemed mapped out. A good marriage, a beautiful life, a career she loved. And then in her final year, a friend pulled her aside and told her the truth. Ben had been seeing another woman. For months. Belle confronted him directly, and Ben's response was almost casual in its cruelty. "Why, Isobel?" he said, smiling. "You don't suppose that after we're married I'm not going to take out another woman if I want to?" Belle's world collapsed. She walked away with as much dignity as she could hold together, and then, out of his sight, she broke. In the weeks that followed, she could not sleep. She could not eat. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her mother's persistent cheerfulness only made things worse. Her father, sensing her desperation, came one night to her bedside and began to pray quietly for her. Belle, still awake, eyes closed, fuming, interrupted him. "Thanks, Dad. I know you mean well. But praying doesn't go beyond the ceiling. Don't bother." The days that followed were the darkest of her young life. And then came that night, the night she found herself standing in the hallway, her hand on the bathroom doorknob, a bottle of poison on the other side of that door. What stopped her was not a vision. There were no angels. There was no burning bush. There was only the sound of her father groaning in his sleep from the other room, and in that groan, something broke through the fog. If she drank that poison, her father would spend the rest of his life wondering if she had gone to hell. She could not do it to him. She turned around. She tiptoed back to her bedroom. And then, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark, a single line from a poetry exam drifted back into her mind. It was from Dante Alighieri, written in Latin, "In la sua voluntate e nostra pace." In his will is our peace. She did not fully believe it, but she had nothing else. So in the dark, she lifted her hands and made a bargain with God. "God, if there be a God, if you will prove to me that you are, and if you will give me peace, I will give you my whole life. I'll do anything you ask me to do. Go anywhere you send me. For the rest of my life." No stars fell. No lights flashed. She climbed into bed and closed her eyes. The next morning she woke up having slept, truly, deeply, peacefully slept, for the first time in weeks. That night was the hinge on which the entire story turned. Belle told no one. It was a private transaction between her and a God she was not entirely sure existed. She began reading the Bible in her room, quietly, just the words of Jesus at first. She began praying. Not loudly, not publicly, just alone, in the dark, testing this God to see if he was real. And slowly, impossibly, something in her began to thaw. The real turning point came at a birthday party, of all places. Ben showed up with his new companion. Belle felt the old rage surge through her, and she fled upstairs to a dressing room, shaking, teeth chattering, reliving every moment of her humiliation. And then she did something she had never done before in such a moment. She prayed out loud. She lifted her trembling hands and cried, "Oh God, if you are real, please give me." She never finished the sentence. Something like an electric shock moved through her body. A liquid peace poured through her, and when she opened her eyes and looked at her hands, they were steady. She walked back downstairs, resumed dancing, and when Ben asked her to dance, she accepted and felt nothing but freedom. God had answered her. Undeniably, physically, immediately. She still told no one. But her mother, sensing a change, talked her into attending a Sunday Bible class with a Professor Ellis, an educated Christian who systematically and graciously addressed every intellectual objection Belle had carried from her university years. Belle began to look forward to those Sundays. Her faith, real, tested, hard-won faith, was taking root. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was the summer of 1923, and Belle attended a Christian conference called the Firs, in Bellingham, Washington, somewhat against her will, truth be told, since a persistent woman named Julia Whipple had sent her a $5 bill and simply refused to take no for an answer. The main speaker that summer was a man named James Fraser, a slender Englishman with blue-gray eyes and a degree in electrical engineering from London University who had given up a promising career to become a missionary with China Inland Mission in 1908. He had been sent to work in a remote region of southwest China near the Burmese border, in a province called Yunnan. And there, in the marketplaces, he had noticed a group of people unlike any he had seen. People in bright clothing woven with strips of color, women with cowrie shells and silver ringlets, men in colorful turbans, speaking a language no one around him spoke. They were the Lisu, a tribal people who lived high in the mountains of the Salween River Valley, isolated from the outside world, practicing demon worship and ancestor reverence, with no written language, no Bible, no knowledge that Jesus Christ had ever walked the earth. James Fraser began to learn their language. He created a written script for it, the Fraser script. It would come to be called. He began translating the New Testament. He trekked over mountains that fell 12,000 feet into rivers. He lived in bamboo huts. He was thrown into deep depression when years of effort produced almost no converts. And then he wrote to his mother and asked her prayer group to pray, and everything changed. The Lisu began turning to God by the dozens, then by the hundreds, burning their demon altars, building churches, sending their own evangelists out into remote villages. Belle sat in that outdoor auditorium under the Washington pines, and she was transported. She could smell the Yunnan mountains. She could feel the sharp rocks beneath her feet on those narrow trails. She could almost reach out and touch the faces of those Lisu villagers. On the final night of the conference, James made a passionate appeal for young male missionaries to come and help reach the Lisu. And Belle, sitting there knowing she was not a man, knowing she had no money and no support from her family, sat in her seat and prayed quietly, "I'll go, Lord. I'm willing to go. I am not a man, but I will go." She was 22 years old. She had no idea what that prayer would cost her. The obstacles that rose up to stop her were extraordinary. Her mother, the president of the Women's Missionary Society of the Presbyterian Church, erupted. "Isobel Miller, you will be a missionary over my dead body." She burst into tears. She took to her room. Belle's father, gentle and loving but overmatched, asked Belle never to raise the subject again. Her brother was unsupportive. The family was in financial turmoil. There was no money for Bible school, no money for a ship, no path forward visible to any natural eye. But God was already moving. A young woman named Marjorie Harrison had saved every penny for years for her own passage to China as a missionary. Her doctors refused to pass her for service. She suffered from debilitating headaches. She had prayed about what to do with the money. And on the very evening she happened to meet Belle's prayer partner Miss Fouch and heard about Belle's call, she knew exactly where it was meant to go. She gave every penny to Belle, enough for train fare to Chicago and a full year's tuition at Moody Bible Institute. Then Belle's mother, that same woman who had forbidden this very thing, had a moment of unexpected openness and simply said, "You can go to Moody if you like." She seemed to have forgotten her own ultimatum. Belle did not remind her of it. When Belle went to the school registrar to request 10 days off in the middle of her summer courses to attend a Christian conference, a request that had already been denied to another student, the registrar barely looked up from his ledger and said, "Fine." Belle walked out of his office in a daze. Was this God? To us, it unmistakably was. And then came Dr. Isaac Page, the very same man who had placed his hand on 14-year-old Belle's shoulder at that Vancouver dock and prayed, quite specifically, that she would go to China as a missionary. He was now living in Chicago. He walked her into a bank and opened a bank account with $100 already in it. Every obstacle fell. Every wall crumbled. In September 1924, Isobel Miller arrived at Moody Bible Institute in downtown Chicago, just in time for classes to begin. But God was not finished testing her. Shortly after arriving at Moody, Belle received a letter from her mother. She had cancer. Then, before Belle could even fully absorb that news, a telegram arrived. Her mother had chosen surgery. Alice Miller had died on the operating table. The words her mother had spoken rang through Belle's mind like a sentence being carried out. "You will go to the mission field over my dead body." And now her mother was dead. Belle locked herself in her room and wept bitterly. Had she made the right choice? Then came a letter from one of her mother's friends. In it the friend revealed something Alice had written the night before her surgery, in a private letter. She confessed that she had spent her life in busy work, for God, and that she knew, that Isobel was doing the right thing in giving her whole life to him. She said if she lived, she would try to follow her daughter's example. Belle wept again, but differently this time. Her mother had understood. Her mother had approved. In the last night of her life, Alice Miller had released her daughter to God. Even in death, God had been merciful. At Moody, Belle pressed on. She woke at 5:30 every morning, crept to the mop cupboard at the end of the dormitory hallway, turned a scrubbing bucket upside down, and sat on it every single morning to pray, surrounded by mops and cleaning rags, but wrapped in the presence of God. She took a job as a waitress at a Montgomery Ward department store cafeteria to pay her way. She studied missions, preaching, and comparative religion. And in the cafeteria at Moody, across the room one afternoon, her eyes met the eyes of a young, blue-eyed man operating the dishwashing machine. Something passed between them in that glance. She could not explain it. She did not even know his name. His name was John Kuhn. They would eventually fall in love, and he would ask her to be his wife with one of the most unconventional marriage proposals in missionary history, a letter that ended with the instruction to cable the word light if she accepted and dark if she refused. Belle cabled back one word, light. But before any of that could happen, Belle had to face the most humiliating setback of her missionary journey so far. She graduated from Moody in December 1926 and went immediately to the China Inland Mission Candidate School in Toronto. She passed her physical examination, completed her studies, and appeared before the CIM Council for Eastern Canada, the council that would determine whether she was fit to serve. Everything went well, until the council called her back into the room. One of her references, someone who had known her for years, whose identity she would never learn, had written that she was proud, disobedient, and most likely to become a troublemaker on the mission field. The council was not sure what to do with this. Belle sat in stunned silence as the director spent an hour lecturing her about cases of missionaries who had caused problems overseas. And then the director explained that regardless of her suitability, all new missionary operations to China had been suspended due to anti-foreigner uprisings. She was to go back to Vancouver and wait. Belle fled to her room. 3 words circled her mind like vultures: proud, disobedient, troublemaker. A friend from Moody, when she wrote to him in fury about the injustice of it, wrote back with words that hit her like cold water: Belle, if someone accused me of those traits, I would have answered, brother, you haven't told the half of it. She sat with that for a long time. And then something broke open in her. Maybe other people saw things in her that she could not see in herself. Maybe the very qualities that made her so driven, so determined, so uncompromising, maybe those same qualities, untempered, unchecked, unconsecrated, could indeed make her dangerous. She stopped defending herself. She left the matter in God's hands. She went back to Vancouver and worked with a Christian girls' club, ferrying herself across the harbor by ferry late at night, pouring herself into the work, waiting. And then, 18 months later, a letter arrived from Charles Thompson of Sim that contained these remarkable words. From the first, both Professor Ellis and I felt there was a mistake somewhere. So thorough is our confidence in you that we do not find it necessary to call the Western Council together. You are a unanimous choice. You have our complete blessing. She had not defended herself. She had not campaigned for herself. She had trusted God with the injustice, and he had reversed it completely, without her help. On October 11, 1928, Isobel Miller sailed for China. Nothing in Canada, not the hard winters, not the rain, not the long ferry rides across Vancouver Harbor, had prepared Belle for China. Shanghai assaulted every sense she possessed. The stench, the chaos, the thousands of bodies in motion, the flies on the meat in the open-air markets, the sounds of a city more ancient and more overwhelming than anything she had ever encountered. James Fraser himself was waiting for her at the CIM guest house. His eyes were still ablaze with the same fire she remembered from the furs. He led her group south and west, all the way to Kunming, the capital of Yunnan province, where John Kuhn was waiting for her. They were married at the Chinese Church of Kunming on November 4, 1929. Belle had wanted a small, private ceremony. The entire European expatriate community of Kunming showed up. She could not name half of them. But none of that mattered, because in John Kuhn, steady, quiet, brilliant, deeply faithful John, she had found not just a husband but the partner God had always intended for the mission. And now the real work began. Their early years of married missionary life in China were a prolonged and humbling education. Belle had imagined herself arriving, learning the language, and being a model of grace and Christian charity. Instead, she discovered the scum. That word, scum, had been used by an experienced missionary on the voyage to Shanghai who told the new recruits, "When you get to China, all the scum of your nature will rise to the top." Belle had been indignant. How dare she? But she remembered those words when she sat crying into her pillow in a remote Chinese village because the hired cook had served bean curd and rice for the fourth consecutive meal, when fresh vegetables were visible at the market a short walk away. She remembered those words when she hired away a lazy servant and realized within days just how much backbreaking labor that servant had actually been doing for her. She remembered them when she stormed out of her own house and walked miles into the Chinese countryside in a rage, and only stopped when she realized that all the local villagers who saw her scowling face were losing any desire to ask her about the God she served. The scum was real. And the only thing to do with it was exactly what James Fraser had taught her: pray, submit, and trust God to refine what was unrefined. There were also genuine wonders in those early years. Their daughter Catherine, and named Hongyan in Chinese, meaning vast grace, was born in a remote town with no Western doctor, delivered by a Chinese nurse who had brought a textbook on difficult births just in case. The baby was healthy, beautiful, with Belle's dark hair and hazel eyes. The local residents, who had never seen a white baby before, came in a steady stream to pinch Catherine's cheeks for good luck. And then, in March 1934, 10 years after she had first heard James Fraser describe the Lisu at the Firs in Bellingham, Isobel Kuhn finally began the journey to Lisu. She was sick with dysentery for most of it. She rode a mule named Jasper on narrow trails with sheer drops of hundreds of feet on one side. She breathed thin air at 12,000 feet. She crossed raging rivers in the valley floors and climbed the next ridge and crossed the next river and climbed again. And when she finally stood on a mountain ridge and looked out across the Salween River Valley, the scene that stretched before her like endless folds of blue and brown velvet, pine-covered ridges rising almost straight up, icy rivers threading through the valleys below, she wept. After 10 years. She was finally here. The Lisu welcomed them with open arms. In the small bamboo hut of a Christian family, Belle sat on a wooden plank floor and ate corn and pork rind and felt more at home than she had in any grand mission house. She visited Layla Cook, a veteran missionary who had been serving the Lisu Christians in the area, and within hours felt as though they had been friends for life. And then she witnessed something she had never seen in all her years in China among the Han Chinese. On a Sunday evening, Lisu Christians gathered in Layla's hut, men, women, and children who had learned to read and write in their own language, holding translated scripture in their hands, singing in four-part harmony, their voices filling that thin mountain air with a sound that could only be called holy. In all her years in China, Belle had never seen such hunger, such openness, such joy. She stayed 30 days. She assisted in the birth of a baby to the pastor's wife, Moses and Grace, with only a medical textbook and a 2-grain pill of quinine and the desperate prayers of 2 terrified people to guide her. When the baby, little Esther, drew her first breath and cried out into that dimly lit hut, Moses let out a whoop of joy and Belle collapsed in relief. She witnessed a baptism service in a mountain pool, watching 29 Lisu Christians wade into icy water and emerge shivering and radiant, shaking the hand of every church deacon on the other side as a sign of fellowship. And she met 3 men who had walked for 7 days through mountain snow from Burma, surviving 2 previous failed attempts, refusing to go home without a Christian teacher who would come back with them to their village to tell them more about Jesus. They had first heard of Jesus 11 years earlier and had been trying to follow his ways ever since, with no books and no teacher. When Belle looked at John and John looked at Belle, they both knew. This was why she had been born. This was what that terrified 20-year-old girl had agreed to in the dark, with her hands lifted toward a God she wasn't even sure existed. This was in his will, and in his will there was peace. The next years were years of sacrifice and supernatural fruitfulness woven so tightly together they could not be separated. In 1937, Belle had to send her 6-year-old daughter Catherine north to a boarding school in Chefoo, a journey in the opposite direction, farther from her mother, into a country sliding toward war with Japan. Belle wept all night on the streets of Hong Kong and on the train ride toward Yunnan province. John walked with her through those streets, letting her grieve. And somewhere in the middle of that train ride, Belle looked at herself clearly. She was drowning in grief for things she had not yet lost, weeping for a daughter who was alive and well and in good hands, wallowing in self-pity. She dried her tears. She asked God's forgiveness for indulging herself. And she looked forward. Not backward. Forward. That discipline, that hard, costly, repeated discipline of choosing to look forward, became the architecture of her entire missionary life. Belle and John settled permanently in Lisuland in 1938, at Oak Flat Village on the side of a mountain in the Salween River Valley. And there, Belle began the work that would outlast her. She had a vision, a rainy season Bible school. During the wet months, when the mountain trails turned treacherous and the Lisu could not work their fields, she would gather church leaders, evangelists, young men and women, and teach them the Word of God with everything she had. She typed out the books of Galatians and 1 Corinthians in the Lisu language herself, using carbon paper to make 5 copies at a time, and sewed the pages together into study books by hand. She created curriculum. She wrote songs. She prayed. The first rainy season Bible school opened on May 28, 1938, with 18 students. The church elders had been worried about feeding everyone. God provided. In fact, the nearby villages were so grateful for the preaching the students brought to them on weekends that they sent the young evangelists back to Oak Flat loaded with food and silver coins. The school more than fed itself. Among the students was Job, who had once run for days through landslide-blocked mountain trails to bring 2 missionary nurses to Belle's side when she was wasting away with a mysterious illness and had stopped eating. Job made it to the distant town of Paushan in 4 days rather than the normal 6, and he arrived with infected feet from running so far in bare feet, but he arrived. And the nurses he brought back saved Belle's life. There was Homie, plump, quiet, confident, extraordinary Homie, who became Belle's most beloved disciple and closest friend, who had lost her first fiancé to drowning on a mission trip to Burma, who typed the Bible school curriculum, who helped nurse Belle through illness, who married a fine young man named Thomas and presented him with a baby son. Homie, who died young, her body wasted away by a disease no one could diagnose or stop, leaving behind a husband and an 18-month-old child. Belle did not know how to bear it. But she bore it, because there was more to be done. Students from the rainy season Bible school went out as evangelists to remote areas no missionary had ever reached. 2 of them, Aristarchus and Secundus, traveled to a distant region east of the Yangtze Gorge called Yangpei, where they planted churches among an entirely unreached Lisu people. Within months, 35 families, 200 people, had become Christians. Then they made contact with the fearsome Lolo tribe, who had terrorized the entire region for generations, kidnapping and ransacking. From that first contact, eventually 250 Lolo people became Christians and built their own chapel. Belle had sent 2 young men from a Bible school in a bamboo hut, and they had reached the unreachable. The kingdoms of the Lisu and the Lolo were falling to the Word of God, carried by people whose names the world would never record, who had learned to read and pray and preach in a mountain village in a school that ran on corn and rain and the Spirit of God. Then the world caught fire. December 7, 1941. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. America declared war. And suddenly Belle and John, and every European missionary in China, were the enemy of the Japanese, no longer neutral guests in a foreign land. The news arrived weeks late to Lisuland. Belle's first thought was Catherine. Her daughter was in the CIM school in Chefoo, in the northeast of China, far too close to the fighting. Every motherly instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to go, to find her child. Common sense had to restrain her. She could not reach Chefoo if it was under attack. All she could do was pray. She prayed. She held women's Bible schools in John's absence. She prayed some more. And she waited for news. The news came. The Japanese had captured 97 missionary children from the school in Cheifu and placed them in an internment camp. Catherine was among them. The teachers and staff were with them, and Roxy Fraser, widow of James Fraser, was there with her 3 daughters. Belle shuddered to think what the Japanese might do to her daughter. She chose, again, to give this to God. Not easily, not painlessly, but deliberately. She refused to let her imagination devour her. In the spring of 1942, Belle had to make a harrowing journey to Kunming to treat an infected tooth that had spread throughout her body, a journey that would have killed her if she had waited one more day, according to the dentist who examined her. She traveled part of the way with Flying Tiger's pilots on the infamous Burma Road, which looped back on itself through treacherous hairpin bends, the wrecks of previous vehicles visible far below at the bottom of every turn. Their vehicle broke down in the middle of nowhere. She eventually arrived in Kunming with no luggage, no money, and very nearly no life. Then she was evacuated by the British consul with a Royal Air Force convoy north to Sichuan province, hundreds of miles from Oak Flat, from John, from the Lisu. She was alone in a strange province with only the clothes on her back. She went to a churchyard. She prayed. She left with a confidence that her situation would change. The next morning, a telegram from John arrived, the first proof that he was still alive. And in a bag of mail that arrived that same week were 2 letters from a young woman Belle and John had given a portion of their inheritance to years before. She had insisted on repaying the gift. Each letter contained a check for $50. Belle had exactly enough money to travel back to Yunnan, with just enough left over to bring her friend Eva along. $200. 2 letters. 2 answers to prayer, delivered in the same bag of mail, on the same morning as the telegram from her husband. Belle laughed with pure delight. She made it back. Through a bombed-out Paoshan, through Chinese military checkpoints, through the mountain trails of Lisu, she made it back to Oak Flat, and she never stopped working. The war ground on. Japanese fighters flew over Lisu, and the Lisu, who had never seen airplanes, called them flying houses, and 1,000 purring tigers with wings that did not flap. Chinese troops were deployed into the valley, burdening the local Christians with demands for food and labor. Windwards, rumors of approaching armies, of massacres, of Japanese soldiers just over the next ridge, swept through the villages constantly, paralyzing people with fear. Belle refused to be paralyzed. She held Bible schools. She wrote songs. She taught the women, the teenagers, the boys. She organized Christmas and Easter celebrations that drew hundreds of Lisu Christians from across the mountain valleys, their voices rising in 4-part harmony under the open sky, handshaking as a sign of fellowship, their faces radiant with a joy that no army could take away. In 1943, Belle discovered at the age of 41 that she was expecting another child. She was pregnant. In Lisu, during a war. With Japanese fighters overhead. She did not stop working. She ran a Bible school for 76 teenage boys that spring, taught them to preach and to evangelize, and watched God move among them. On August 1, 1943, her son Daniel was born, downy red hair, pearly white skin, a wonder to every Lisu who came to look at him. She named him Danny, and she wished with all her heart that there was some way to tell Catherine that she had a little brother. Eventually, inevitably, the Communists came. The Chinese Civil War between the nationalist government and Mao Zedong's communist forces had been burning for years alongside the war with Japan. By 1949, Japan was defeated, but the Communists had won China. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The nationalist government fled to the island of Formosa. And the remaining foreign missionaries in China knew that their time was running out. The Communists had a strategy. First, they would send bands of thugs to terrorize villages, killing people, burning houses, stealing livestock. Then Communist soldiers would arrive to liberate the village from the thugs, and the traumatized, grateful villagers would give their allegiance to the party. The thugs came to the Salween River Valley. On Christmas Eve 1948, a band of them came looking specifically for Belle at Oak Flat. They did not find her. She had moved weeks earlier. Frustrated, They went to a nearby village and in the dead of night dropped hand grenades on sleeping Christians. 13 men were killed. Belle knew the end was near. But there was still work to do. In early 1950, just before she and Danny had to flee, Belle and John held the biggest rainy season Bible school they had ever run. Dozens of students, the fullest curriculum they had ever taught. They poured everything they had into those final weeks. They wanted to give the Lisu church everything it would need to survive without them. On March 10, 1950, Belle and her 6-year-old son Danny left Oak Flat for the last time. Belle turned and looked at the bamboo huts, the mountain trails, the faces of the Lisu Christians who had come to see her off. She knew. She would never see any of them again. John stood on a rocky outcrop and waved. She turned and walked forward. Her Lisu guides, faithful, brave men who were risking their own lives, led her and Danny over 11,000-foot snowbound Pienma Pass into Burma. Then 10 days through jungle, staying close together to discourage tiger attacks, to the Burmese town of Myakina. From there to Rangoon. From Rangoon by plane to Hong Kong. And nearly 3 months after leaving Oak Flat, a ship carried Belle and Danny into Vancouver harbor. She had no visa, no money, only the clothes on her back and a 6-year-old boy who had walked over a mountain. She was greeted at the dock by her brother, the Whipple children, and a group of women who had once been young girls in the corner club where she had worked all those years ago, before China, before the Lisu, before everything. She slept for 2 days. But even in America, Belle could not stop. She moved to Wheaton, Illinois, pooled resources with 2 other widowed missionary women and typed. She typed for the Lisu. She typed precious things of the lasting hills, and nests above the abyss, and stones of fire, books that brought the Lisu to life for readers thousands of miles away, books that were so vivid, so tender, so honest about the cost and the glory of following God into hard places, that they moved people to prayer and to action and to faith. Her prayer letters were duplicated and circulated across North America. Strangers wrote to her asking about Lisu Christians by name, about Homi, about Mead Mipa, about little Esther born by candlelight in a mountain hut. In 1952, at the age of 51, Belle traveled with John to Thailand, newly renamed Overseas Missionary Fellowship Country, to begin again among the tribal people of northern Thailand, including thousands of Lisu who had fled across the border from China. She ran a guest house for OMF missionaries in Chiang Mai, hiked into Lisu villages in the mountain highlands, and began the painstaking, patient, thrilling work of evangelization all over again. She saw Father Wood, an elderly Lisu man crippled with arthritis and addicted to opium, take down his demon altar and burn it, and slowly, miraculously, rise from his mat and walk. She kept climbing, because to stay still, she had learned, was to die. And then, in 1953, she noticed something. Something in her body that should not have been there. A doctor in Chiang Mai confirmed it in October 1954. Breast cancer. At the age of 53, Isobel Kuhn had one more mountain to climb. Surgery. Radiation treatment in Philadelphia. A doctor's prognosis that was honest and not hopeful. The cancer would eventually spread throughout her body. She was given no timeline. She was given no guarantees. She went home to Wheaton, set up her typewriter, and kept writing. She wrote Ascent to the Tribes and Green Leaf in Drought, and By Searching and In the Arena. She wrote prayer letters, and in one of them she said something that has echoed across the decades like a bell. John and I are anxious that this news should not cast a gloom over you. There is no gloom in our hearts. There is no gloom in his heart as he watches over me. Why should there be in yours? No gloom. In a body riddled with cancer. In a life that had cost her a daughter's childhood, a son raised in a war zone, 15 years of mountain trails and dysentery and bamboo huts, the loss of her closest friends, the loss of her home, the loss of her country, no gloom. In February 1955, Belle's daughter Catherine was accepted as an OMF missionary to northern Thailand, to the Lisu. Belle had to hold herself still to let her go. She knew, with the certainty of a dying woman, that she would never see Catherine on earth again. She thought of her own mother, who had tried to stop her with tears and fury all those years ago. And she refused to be that mother. She kissed Catherine and let her go. There were tears. There was joy. And there was the deep, unshakable peace of a woman who had, long ago, decided that in his will was her peace. On March 20, 1957, Isobel Kuhn died quietly in Wheaton, Illinois. She was 55 years old. John was at her side. 2 days later, at College Church of Christ in Wheaton, they buried her. And then came a letter. From Lucius, at Oak Flat in the Salween River Valley, now under Communist China. The church was alive. The evangelists were safe. The rainy season Bible school had opened with nearly 80 students. Lucius was visiting over 30 villages a year. There were 270 Christian families in his area alone. And since the communists had taken over, there had been over 700 Lisu baptisms. 700 baptisms. Under communist oppression. In bamboo huts. By the light of fires on mountainsides. In icy pools. Among people who had once worshipped demons and now sang to the living God in four-part harmony, shaking hands with one another as a sign of Christian fellowship, because an English missionary named James Fraser had once shaken hands with them and they had decided it must mean something holy. The Lisu Church survived the communists. It survived the Cultural Revolution. It is alive today. And it began, in no small part, with a 20-year-old girl in a dark hallway in Vancouver who let go of a doorknob, went back to her room, lifted her hands, and said, "God, if there be a God, I will give you my whole life." He heard her. He took her at her word. And he gave her a life that was not dull, not quiet, not safe, but blazing. Blazing with the fire of the Holy Spirit. Blazing with love for the Lisu. Blazing with the undeniable reality of a God who is not silent, not distant, and not done. What, then, shall we learn from Isobel Kuhn? We learn that God is not put off by our doubts. Belle made her first covenant with God as an agnostic, "If there be a God," and he answered her before morning. We learn that no obstacle is too large when God has called you. Money, opposition, family resistance, institutional rejection, war, sickness, none of it stopped her, because none of it had the final word. We learn that the scum will rise. Our worst selves will show up on the mission field, in the hard marriage, in the hard season, in the long obedience. But the scum is not the end of us. It is the material God refines, if we stop defending it. We learn that the work outlasts the worker. Belle never lived to see the full harvest of what was planted through her hands and her tears. But the harvest came. The Lisu Church grew in the dark, under oppression, without any missionary present, because the roots went deep and the Spirit of God is not dependent on a foreign passport. And we learn what she herself learned, somewhere on a mountain trail between China and Burma, with her hand on a mule's tail and her feet in the dark, climb or die. There is no neutral ground in the life of faith. You press forward, trusting the God who promised that in his will is your peace, or you stop, and something in you slowly dies. Isobel Kuhn chose to climb. And all of heaven echoed with the sound of her footsteps. If the story of Isobel Kuhn has stirred something in your heart today, if you felt the fire, felt the conviction, felt that quiet tug of the Spirit asking you what you would give if God truly asked you for everything, then you are exactly who this channel exists for. Please take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of the heroes of faith who walked this earth before us and left behind a trail of fire for us to follow. And we would love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you watched the story of Isobel Kuhn today. Whether you're in Lagos or London, in Nairobi or New York, in the mountains or in the valley, God sees you, and he is calling you to climb. Until next time, keep the fire burning.